Today, we're going to look into the basics of variable fonts, how you can use them in Figma, and what it took for the team here at Figma to actually support them as well. So we're going to talk to some folks from the team. Clara and I are designer advocates here at Figma, and we're going to be your hosts for today. So again, my name's Anthony, and I'm joined by Clara here as well. Joining us, we'll also have Key, who's a software engineer on one of the engineering team that worked on this project, as well as Amanda, a product designer, also working on variable fonts. And they're going to walk us through a demo of using variable fonts in Figma and also share some details behind the scenes during the implementation of it as well. Before we jump in, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. So this session is going to be recorded. All of the sessions are available on youtube.com/Figma Design. You can find all of our previous live streams there as well. You will have the recording afterwards. If any questions come up, please use the Q&A button in the Zoom feature. So you'll notice that there's a button in your panel that says Q&A. This is actually a great way for us to be able to track the questions. So if you do want to ask questions, use Q&A, and then there is a chat as well. So if you do want to just chat, shout out, say how awesome variable fonts are, feel free to use the chat for that. But do make sure that you have it set to everyone so that that we can hear you. We love getting personal messages, but we want to make sure that everybody can chat too as well. And lastly, most importantly, this going to direct you to our code of conduct. Obviously we love to have a lot of fun on these, and the way that we can do that is by everyone being kind and respectful and having empathy for each other. So with that, let's go ahead and get things started off. I'm going to pass it off to Clara now for a little bit of an introduction on variable fonts.
Amazing. I'm unmuted, I think. Perfect. Hey, everyone. My name's Clara. And again, thank you all for joining us. We're excited to dive into what variable fonts are, how Figma supports it, and some key use cases you might apply to your workflow today. So what exactly are variable fonts? Back in 2016, Apple, Adobe, Microsoft, Google, and some other independent type foundries jointly announced that font variations were being added to OpenType, which is the standard format for digital fonts. And so variable fonts are an evolution of this OpenType specification, allowing access to a continuous range of options on a given characteristic. So for example, for fonts that don't support these characteristics, the weight of a font can be changed from hairline to bold, along a set number of values. Now, to move back in time a little bit, when printing required physical blocks for each letter, there were explicit sets of letters that were bold or italic. You've got your one regular set, one bold set, and this was carried on into the digital space with your few sets there. And so in this spectrum of weights, we have these set definitions, maybe a 400 value for regular, a 700 for bold, and so on. Now with variable fonts, we now have access to this entire range of values. So if a value of 635, for example, for the weight is more appropriate in its context, we now have that option to make that customization. And so here you can see this continuous range that we have once we use variable fonts. Instead of these sort of static options, you have that entire slider that you're free to choose from. Speaking of customizations, each of these characteristics are called axes. So earlier I was showing that weight axes, the one associated with being bold versus regular, but there are many axes we can play with. These are the 5 registered axes, but type designers can also create custom ones. Here we've got the 5 registered ones, which are weight, width, italic, slant, and optical size. And the reason these 5 are considered standard or registered is because they map to these standard CSS attributes. Here you can see some of these characteristics. You've got width, changing the width of each letter, the weight, we've got italic and slant, and Amanda will be demoing these in more detail in a moment. So why might someone want to use variable fonts? One reason is brand expression. So you just have that larger range of levers to pull when working with type. Another reason is for accessibility. We've got, all those extra options when designing for things like dark mode or for smaller text that you have. And just in general, we've got lots of fine-tuning opportunities. And lastly, I wanted to call out performance. In many cases, loading times for using a variable font will be less, given that multiple files don't have to be loaded in. However, this is not always true. So I just want to make a quick little disclaimer there. The sort of loose rule of thumb here is that for every additional axis you might have, that might equate to one file. So in this example that I'm showing now, if there were 40 axes, you may not see any performance gains here. And with that, I'll pass it off to Amanda to walk us through each of these axes.
All right, let me share my screen. Oh, y'all can see, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, over here you see this card design with this very uniform stylistic of type on the surface. So if I were to click on the title over here, I'm using enter, and the weight that I'm using is regular. So I can click on the style dropdown to select other styles that are available to this font. And these invariable fonts are called named instances, and they essentially map to the static styles of typefaces. At the very bottom, I can also click on this variable font axis option. And when I click on it, I enter the type settings panel and with the variable tab selected. So you'll see that the type settings is like a little bit updated. We now have 3 different tabs for the most basic features of detail open type features and variable section. And in the variable section, I have these axes. And another way I can get access to the sliders is by clicking on the type settings button, and I'll get to the same space. So in this case, let's say I want to increase the weight of this font. I can like slide it along the slider, and you'll see that we have these markings or these notches along the slider. Each one of them corresponds to a value in the named instance. So weight 700 corresponds to bold, for instance. 800 is extra bold. And let's say in this case, I want to use a weight that's in between bold and extra bold. I can easily slide to that. This also works with arrow key. So up arrow key increases this number by 1, and down arrow key increases it by 1. Shift up changes it by 25, and shift down changes it by 25 too. Perfect. So, and then I can also click on this like body text, click on the type settings button. And in this case, let's say I want to change the font by, maybe regular is just a little bit too light for me. I want to increase it by just a bit. Now I have the weight to be 420. So let's say in this case, I want to make this read now button match the weight of the title. And in most cases, you would either have to like create a style, or in the case of variable fonts, like memorize what number you were previously using and then apply that again in the type settings menu. But in this case, Figma actually, like we decided to list all the custom instances that you've used in your file at the bottom of the styles dropdown so that you can quickly access them without having to set up styles. In this case, I can click on that and it'll be applied. And for these numbers, I'm also gonna apply the same weight as I did with the body paragraph.
That's so great that we keep the weights currently in use as sort of a second section down below in the style list.
Yeah, like we think it'll be easy for you to quickly access them without too much setup. Something else that's pretty cool. So width obviously changes the width of the typeface or the font that you're using, and it could be also used for internationalization. So over here we have an English menu, and at the bottom a German menu. And you'll see that the German menu is just a little bit too long. So if I wanted to use the same font as the English menu in the German version, then I have to like bump down the weight by a little. And variable fonts allow for super refined customization so that I can get the exact width that I want for this menu to fit. I'm gonna go into the type settings and just turn down the width just a little bit. Yeah, probably something around that would work. And this is using Noto Sans. So grade is this very interesting axis. It's not a registered axis, but some fonts do offer them. So grade usually changes the thickness of a font without changing the overall width of the font. So when you think of weight, where if you increase the weight, it changes the width, but also the overall width of the font. Grade doesn't change the overall width, but just the thickness in general. And it does so quite subtly. And historically, in the age of letterpress printing, grade is actually used to compensate for ink spread that might happen when using different types of ink and different types of paper. So when printing on a paper that would allow for a lot of ink spreading around the actual print, you would use a lower grade to compensate for that spread. And in digital design, grade can be used to make text look better in dark mode and look more accessible in dark mode. So over here, I have these two types. They're all using roboto serif in the regular weight, but just by visually looking at this, the light on dark text feels and looks a lot thicker. And this is because as light is emitted through the characters, it creates this glow around the edges of the text. And so I can click on the dark mode one and bump down the grade just a little bit so that it optically feels more similar to the light mode version. So maybe something like this. And yeah, it's a very subtle adjustment, but it does make a lot of difference.
Like I see this a lot with small typefaces too, right? Like when you're working on much smaller screens where you're going to have the aliasing of what's getting rendered by the particular device may have a tougher time with lighter weights. You might get something that feels a bit fuzzier, whereas now you can really bump up that weight so that it feels more balanced visually too, right?
Yeah, and also when designing for people with low vision or people like maybe reading in a very dark situation, having a higher grade can actually compensate for that and make those experiences easier.
Oh, neat.
Yeah. Another thing on small sizes, optical size. So optical size subtly changes, or it changes the drawings and the spacing of the typeface so that it either works better for small text or headline text. And so over here, I have font size, and on the left, I have, if I go into the type settings menu, on the left, I have this, I have two typefaces that are both set at 100. And on the left side, the optical size is very low, it's 9. And on the right side, the optical size is very high, 144. And low optical size is meant for smaller font size. In this case, text becomes more readable by having open counters, by becoming a little bit thicker, having less contrast, maybe taller X height, and just larger details. Whereas for the higher optical size, we see things like higher contrast and more refined details that make the text appear just more intricate at a display headline style of text. And so this effect will become more apparent as I actually lower the font size for the one using low optical size. So let's say I turn this to like 40, and now at the smaller size, because optical size match is also very low, text actually becomes quite readable at the size. And at Figma, we actually have this toggle that allows you to set optical size automatically. So if I turn this on, this number will be synced to my font size number. So if I change the font size number, optical size also changes along with it. And for most fonts, this will be turned on by default. In some cases where this isn't turned on by default is when the text actually, when the typeface contains styles that have a specific optical size. So in this case, I'm using square variable, and it has a text version, and it also has a display version. And in these cases, we want to preserve the font designer's intent by not overriding optical size.
I'm so curious as to how they came up with that font name.
Yeah. All right. So something that also super fun about variable fonts is it allows for a lot of expression. So over here, I'm using recursive. And recursive is this Google font that contains just a ton of different axes. So for instance, not only can I change the weight axes, but also things like slant, which adjusts the tilt. Mono, what changes if the font is a monospace font versus if it's not a monospace font. Casual, as I turn up the casual slider, the typeface resembles more of like brush lettering. And cursive changes how cursive the font is by swapping out the glyphs. So you can see by just sliding around with these sliders, I can change up the expression of these fonts while still using the same typeface. All right, there we go. And sometimes some variable fonts get quite wacky. So this font is called wave font, and you can basically change the alignment of it, change the radii of it, just create something fun. Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities with fonts that do something fun for you that you can utilize in your design. And yeah, I think that's it for me on my part. I'll hand it off to Key to talk about the engineering perspective of variable fonts.
All right, thanks Amanda for the great walkthrough. It has been a great pleasure working with you and the team on the variable fonts project. So my name is Key, and I'm going to take you guys behind the scene on how the variable font feature came together at Figma. So although we launched variable fonts at Config, we've been making small incremental updates to Figma to nudge users and then organizations towards the direction of variable fonts. Font changes are also very global and affect all Figma users. So we staged the rollout over 6 months to mitigate risk. The first stage of the rollout was silent to most of our users. In November of last year, we added support for named instances. No control to the variable axes yet, but if you have named styles from a variable font file you have installed locally, you would be able to access them in Figma. We also added support for organizations and teams to upload shared variable fonts and update their existing font repositories to variable versions. We also invited some org admins to a beta test at the point, but we also asked that these admins from some of our biggest org users actually wouldn't drop the names, but they have thousands, if not more users, to keep it a secret to their users, swap the font, and observe if there's any increase to bug reports that could be caused by this change to switching shared fonts to variable fonts. The second stage of the rollout was also silent to our users. So in January, we started rendering all Google fonts in the editor with variable font whenever it's possible. Users should notice some very subtle performance increases when switching between styles as Clara has mentioned, this was also to test our hypothesis on the performance angle of variable fonts in our own product. You see on the slides here, there's some pretty major differences. If you use the weight switch toggle in the editor to switch between different weight, you're getting a much better experience with variable fonts. And editing or clicking into the text box of an old text box rendered with non-variable fonts will cause the text box to be re-rendered with variable fonts. But that process should not be visible to our end users. And we did extensive testing so that it would not break files for our users. Once again, the goal is to kind of slip the change under the radar and update our user text boxes ahead of time to get ready for variable fonts launch at config. And then the last stage was actually just flipping over some internal parameters to turn the full UI on and enable people to have control over the axes during config in May. Easy peasy. So next part, this is the part that I'm very excited about. I'm going to share some internal explorations of variable font that didn't turn out to be great fit for the product, but were fun to build nonetheless. So these explorations came together by just a bunch of type nerds at Figma going down rabbit holes on what's possible with variable fonts, which was something that we were very excited about. These prototypes were made back in 2019, which was way before variable fonts was on the radar for the Figma editor. We had this idea of previewing the text boxes at different variation values so that you can have an idea of what each axis does. Especially for some axes, weight or width could be more self-explanatory, but how the font would react on the italic axes or what optical sizes is pretty, could it be pretty opaque to our users. You can see for Gimlet, there are 4 axes. By the way, one of my favorite fonts from DJR has 4 axes. And here's what they can do. It works even better for fonts with axes that are more atypical. For example, this font is called Plastic. It has a very wide range of weights that's supported, as seen on the top. And on the bottom, this is a preview of the serif axis. This is a non-registered axis to turn on serifs. And you can also specify the length of serifs for certain characters. And this gives us a nice preview of what it does. The next step is to see if we can interactively aid users with some minuscule adjustment to their text. So this is Roboto Flex, still the same preview here to show you what the axis is capable of, but then we took it a step further to make it interactive so that the user can select the shape of the glyph that they want without really knowing would that be 200 or 230 on the variable axis parameters, as long as it looks right. We don't hate sliders. Sliders are great, but sometimes it doesn't feel quite intuitive. So we also made some explorations of maybe an alternative to sliders that still works, that as the sliders that people are very familiar with, but feel more on canvas, feels more because you're manipulating an object in Figma.
Oh, this is great. I love
So
that. Yeah, just that direct canvas manipulation, so you don't have to like leave the work that you're looking at.
Yes, this is changes on the weight axis for Roboto. And then the next step is actually when you're hovering on the glyph, it shows you where that particular point of the glyph can go on a variation axis. And you can even drag the glyph to change the value of these axes. It is very satisfying to play with. And then here's another example of directly manipulating the shape of the glyph through this.
Oh, cool.
This is also recursive. There's an axis to make it, I think this is the casual axis, was once again, it's kind of difficult to tell what it does just from the preview or the axis values, but this makes it much more intuitive if you can drag the glyph into certain positions and the text will change accordingly. So all these are screen recordings of our internal interactive prototypes that we will be making public. I'll put together a website for people who are interested to play around with them on their own with their own fonts. You'll be able to find the link in the follow-up email after the office hours, and it should also be somewhere on a YouTube video. I'll also post it on Twitter as well when the playground is ready.
Cool. Talk about playing with type. I mean, that's like really exploratory way to do it. Love it.
Amazing. I always love seeing all the older explorations, and it's wild to think some of those were from 2019. That's super cool. So with all of this information on variable fonts, I think about how this might affect existing workflows, if at all. And one group that I'm thinking of is design system designers. And maybe some of you are on the call joining us today. I'm curious, as a question to direct to Amanda or Key, how might variable fonts affect an existing component library? So essentially, do teams have to refactor their entire type systems? And actually, I'll direct this question at Amanda.
No, teams would not need to have to refactor their entire type system. So if you want to start using variable fonts and you're on a team account, then simply just install the font on your computer and install the variable version of the font on your computer. And Figma will ask, and when you open a Figma file that's using a static version of that font, Figma will ask, ask you to replace that font, replace the static version with the variable version. And once that is done, you'll be able to use the variable version of that font. If you are on a org account or an enterprise account, you can access the shared font feature. So in the admin settings, upload a variable version of the font that you want. And once that's done, all the members of your organization will also have access to that font. And yeah, in all your design files, the font, once you go through the replacement process, the font should automatically update. And then this includes type styles too. So they will just update on their own.
Okay, so it sounds like there's no really immediate change required from library maintainers, which I guess is good to hear. But let's say someone wanted to sort of fine tune their existing type scale. What would be a good way for them to get started?
Yeah, it would be good to look at the existing type styles that you have and think about ways that you can refine them with variable fonts. So for instance, if the jump between H1 and H2 in weight is a little bit too large or too little, you can fine tune the jump by, changing the value in the weight slider. For instance, you can also update your typography for dark mode by changing the grade, or allowing optical size to trickle down through your entire design system so that typefaces or fonts look good at different sizes.
Very cool. Cool. Yeah, that's, I think going from there, what does this mean? When you're actually pulling different styles then, I guess, from the library. Like, how does that change?
Oh, yeah. So if you already have text styles established in your design system, using variable fonts should be pretty automatic. And for design system users, they wouldn't have to change much.
Okay.
Their current workflow, yeah.
And that applies both then on the design system author side, but then also for the end users, that's just sort of happening automatically for them.
Yeah.
Great, cool.
Okay, that's super neat. Sort of to like shift topics a little bit. I know many of us are also excited by how variable fonts might be used to animate font styling. So we can already animate things like position, scale, opacity, rotation, and fill. Can you share more about whether this is possible in Figma? And I'll direct this question at Keith.
Yes, we love Smart Anime, and we probably use too much of it internally at Figma. But unfortunately, smart animation on text isn't possible quite yet. So the reason is very technical. So when you open a file in the viewer mode, we load less resources. For example, we don't actually load the font files that are used by the design file. We only load the vectors that have been laid out already. And animating intermediate states of variable font axes will require us to actually load the font files, and that will have performance implications in the prototype viewer. This is definitely something that is in our backlog, but just given some trade-offs, we might not be able to get to it anytime soon.
Okay, got it.
Cool. Well, I think with that, let's go ahead and transition to the Q&A. I know we've got some great questions that are coming in right now. We certainly have a few more questions for the Figma team too as well, so maybe we can come back to those at the end if we've got some time. But I wanted to go ahead and jump ahead to some of the questions that we have here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again real quick so we can look at a couple of those questions that we have. Great. So I think probably one of the biggest things that we've been hearing so far is like, how is my development team actually going to use this? How am I going to be able to match this and implement this and use it? Well, I have some great news for you, and we're going to take a little bit of a look at some of the developer handoff pieces and how that actually works right now. So I'm going to go ahead and just hop into a couple examples, and we'll take a close look here. So for starters, I think probably the important thing to mention here is that variable fonts have been supported in web browsers since as far back as 2018 was when the W3C fonts 4 module was actually started to be codified and sort of went into implementation. So there's actually been support for variable fonts in browsers for a very, very long time so far. Yeah, that's actually quite a while back now that I think about it. If you want to learn more about this, definitely go check out the MDM, the Mozilla docs on this. You're going to see that there's lots of great details on how to use variable fonts. Probably the most important thing to note is that you can just start using some of those registered axes automatically with the existing CSS values, right? So, and we're talking about CSS here, but you're going to find similar implementations both for iOS as for Android as well. There is support across these platforms, both for their mobile native instances as well as for front-end apps that you're making in the web as well. So one thing to note here is for some of those already registered axes, you can go ahead and continue to use them as expected. So weight is a great example. In fact, let's go back to an example that we have over here. If anyone, by the way, another fun fact, if you want a better version of, not better, but if you want a different version of the fox jumps over the lazy dog or whatever, this is a great sentence that also gives you all of the characters that you might want to test. It's kind of fun. Let's go ahead and just set our default weight here for a second. So I'm going to say something like medium, right? So we have a medium weight on our typeface here. Let me see if I can. Great, it's cool. Just going to quickly bump up the font size of our panels here. Hold on one second. It's a little bit larger. Great, cool. So hopefully everyone can see that a little bit better. Let's hop over to the inspect panel. So by default, right, we have, with using our normal weights, this is what we would expect to see, 500. If we come down to our CSS properties, we're going to see font weight 500 down here, right? So not only do the named registered versions like medium, bold, extra bold work, assuming that those typefaces have those, but you can also use the actual numbering system that we have here as well. And the browsers do a lot of fancy footwork to make those map to whatever is the closest available value for these traditional typefaces, right? Where all you have are these particular weights that you've defined. Variable fonts are supported pretty directly for CSS. So all we have to do is, let's say we did set this to a variable weight. So, or sorry, let's go ahead and, yeah, we'll change our weight axis on this one. So let's go to variable font axes. And I'm going to adjust our weight again to kind of like what Amanda showed here, where we're going to go in between two of our weights. We'll go for 640 here. And now you can see we have that custom weight that's showing up right here in our panel. And if we go to the inspect panel, you're going to see that that font weight is actually just defined as that number. You can see it up here too in the panel. If you want to copy these values, you can just quickly copy like that. You can get all those values together. And that's how that's defined. It's that simple, right? The one thing that you have to do differently here is when you're declaring your typefaces. So if you use the @fontface property to do this, or if you're loading them via a CDN or however you want to load your typefaces, you'll need the variable font version of that, right? And so going back to what Clara was saying at the beginning there, if you have several different, if you have a typeface that has a few axes, you're going to see a big savings in what we call like the request header sizes and things like that. So your actual sites can load faster. Again, there is a tipping point there where if you start using too many axes, it may actually end up being not as small as the old typeface. So again, that's a great place to do some testing and just to double check. And it's always good to balance what is the performance that you're looking for there as well. So what's really cool with this is that we did this with one of those registered axes, right? We did this with, or pretty standard ones here, this font weight. Let's go ahead and do this again with a different property. So I'm going to go here and we'll select optical size. Actually, optical size, I may need a different typeface that has a slightly different axes, but let's go ahead and just check this anyways. You can see here that in the panel, it's also going to see if you have other things applied. So this little +1, right? That's letting me know that I actually adjusted not only the weight, but an additional axes here as well. If we go back to the inspect panel, we're now going to see this other new CSS property called font variation settings. So for any of those additional axes that don't have a one-to-one CSS correlation or potentially have a CSS correlation, font variation settings is actually a way that all of those can be defined, and the default ones can be defined here too. So things like weight and otherwise and optical size or anything like that can be defined with this font variation settings. Again, all of the details for that you can find here in the MDN resources, and you can sort of see how here's how grade and weight are being applied via those settings, right? So that's a pretty helpful way to do that too as well. And again, a lot of this stuff is just already supported. So there isn't a whole lot you have to do. Developers can go in and grab this information directly from here as well. Clara, Key, Amanda, I don't know if you had anything to add on the developer handoff side of things. Anything I might have missed? Cool. Great, so hopefully that's helpful. Again, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A, and we will keep going with some more questions that we have here. All right, Samuel, are these variable instances supported when you hand it off to a developer, and are they understood? Oh yeah, perfect. This is actually just a great segue from what we were just talking about. So I don't know if anyone else wants anything to add here, but kind of what I was just saying a second ago, they will be understood by default. The one thing that your development teams will have to do is just ensure that that variable typeface is implemented, right? So Figma does some cool stuff behind the scenes so that we can understand, like if we have variable font versions available, we can load those automatically. Whereas if you're building a custom application, your font declarations may need to be updated to be using the variable font versions, not the, you might have had previous 5 or 6 different font face declarations for different weights or different families and things like that. You could now reduce those down to the single variable font file version as well.
Yep, I can also talk about native support for variable font on different platforms. So the web is actually the last platform to fully support variable fonts. So on macOS, variable fonts has been available before the open type format. This was when Apple was still trying to make the standard and a competing standard with Microsoft. about variable font that has since been deprecated. But macOS first supported variable fonts in 2007 with macOS 10.5 Leopard, and on iOS, it was available since iOS 3.1, which was released in 2009. Android was a little bit behind, but they added full support for variable fonts in Android Oreo, that's API version 27, made in 2017. The only thing I would note here is if you're making a Windows application, things might not quite work before Windows 10. So below Windows 10, Windows 8 had some support for variable font, but not I believe only the axes that are officially defined, sometimes not for custom axes. And you should only expect variable font to fully work on a native application on Windows in versions above 10. However, this doesn't matter if you're implementing this in a browser. If you're doing this on a browser, you can expect it to work on all major releases of major browsers, regardless of the native version that the browser is running on.
Nice. Yeah, I think we've got the last to get on board was Edge, but even that was already back at like late 2018. So you should have some pretty good support going way back. Sadly, no Internet Explorer for anyone who's still holding out. But awesome. Great. So we got another question here. How do you share the specs of a font and styles with the dev team? I mean, if I choose 723 and they set it up in the CSS, just with that value or specific viewports? Oh, good question here, right? So should we be defining the value for viewports in between different font sizes? Will adjust as is? Great question. We answered, I think, a little bit of the first part here earlier, just as far as, yeah, you can absolutely use those values directly, and all of the major browsers and native platforms will support that. But great question on viewports. I don't know if anyone else is interested in taking this. I have some thoughts, but I'm curious if y'all have some ideas here.
It's probably up to the discretion of the engineering team on how to implement this, but a good rule of thumb is wherever you were previously using, say you're setting the font style and the font family, say on like an outer div and in a web application, that could still be the place for you to specify variable font styles, but instead of using the font style attribute, you could be using font variation settings, etc.
Yeah, that's great. I think and also like so for anyone on the development side, like if we talk about like front end side of things, right? So this means you can continue to change typefaces as you would with your media queries, even with some of the newer container queries and things like that, right? So you can have some pretty responsive type sizes that adjust. And on the web, you'll actually find that there are some aspects of that you can add transitions to as well. So you can do some pretty interesting things there. As far as like mapping that to how you might do things in Figma, I think that this is a great place where you can continue to use your different typeface sizes, but maybe defining those as different styles, right? So while we don't have breakpoint adjustments in prototyping view in Figma today, you can set up those different styles, organize them as you would, consistently as you have, again, very similar to what you'd be doing with different typefaces, different styles today, but setting those up as styles within Figma using the styles panel, right? So if we come down here and we can create a new text style, having all of those defined, and then when you go ahead and you set up your most common screen sizes within Figma, this is where, generally speaking, what you've done is with your development team, you sort of define, well, okay, well, what are those key breakpoints? What are those key sizes that we care most about? And then from there, once those are implemented, you can start to suss out some of the small differences or the nuances that may occur when you get close to those breakpoints, right? When things can start to break in that sense. And that's probably a better place to do some of that too. Awesome. Great. So next question, how would you recommend communicating specific variable font specs to developers? Ooh, especially for the direct manipulator. Great question. So just to be clear on that, the direct manipulation stuff, those were some early explorations of how this stuff can be done, and there'll be some cool stuff released on that. For now, it's mainly going to be those sliders that you're working with. Curious if anyone has any thoughts on this one.
I'd also like to point out there's on the inspect panel above all the CSS stuff, there should be some columns where it would show variations as well in a more readable format. If you go to typography, maybe that's because this one doesn't have a custom variation, that is not, but you can see the optical size on here.
Gotcha. So here we go. Like,
yes, so custom variations will show up on there.
Font, right. Oh, I actually don't remember how to type furway font.
If you do recursive, that'll show the variation.
Yeah, let's do
and
recursive.
then like
okay, yeah,
all
that
the
sounds
little,
great.
yeah.
So if we do recursive, and we grab one of those very custom axes that we have here, right? So if we do adjust these a little bit here, great. So now if I go to the inspect panel, I'm going to be able to see those variations called out. Is this sort of what we're talking about? Yeah, that's awesome. And then that there is actually what's translating to font variation settings down here in the CSS properties as well.
Yep.
Very cool. And I would say maybe just one last thing, like as with everything that we do, when you talk about communicating specs to the developers, I mean, communication is key above all else, right? Like if that means leaving notes, if that means leaving stickies, having it as a separate discussion before you get into the designs can also be really helpful, right? If there are things that are established across your entire system, talking about those in the context of the entire system can be really valuable versus someone coming across that in one particular design, because that way when they come across that, they're going to already be aware of, oh yeah, this is part of our system. This is part of something that we've had a conversation about too. All right. Do variable fonts work on individual letters or words? Looks like Sula's got us here on this one. Yes, yes, they absolutely do. Just to give you a quick example of that, if I can go and select these two letters right here, you'll see if I could pop into our variable fonts menu, I can adjust the individual characters there. As with everything in design, your judgment call will certainly probably be the defining factor of when and why you should do this. But you have the freedom and you have the capability to explore all these ideas now.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, of course.
So for some axes, the type designer actually specifies just like exactly what letters they want to impact. So for fonts, for instance, maybe I should like.
Yeah, do you want to share?
Yeah, one sec. Oh, there we go. Give me a sec. Let me share my screen. Okay, so if I were to use recursive on this, and then some axes actually only like influence certain characters. So in the variable setting, if that is a very interesting bug. Wait. Yeah, if I were to change like the cursive axis, for instance,
oh, interesting.
See how only certain letters are being affected. And another interesting thing is that they change in like a very binary way. So if I have the cursive setting to 1, it changes, and then I have the cursive setting to anything below 1, it also changes to a different set of drawings. So yeah, some axes actually aren't continuous. They have certain stops, and some axes only affect certain letters.
And there are ways for the type designers to actually bind preference to some of those particular axes. Like when you switch between them, the optical size can be can automatically adjust appropriately depending on how the type designer has set up those relationships.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, some very cool stuff. Should it be a toggle instead of a slider? And that's a good question. I wonder if, I don't know about that one. Maybe the slider keeps the door open for if they ever want to add more granularity in the future. There's my simple answer. Great. Okay, I think we just have a couple more questions, and then we'll probably wrap things up here too as well. So, Clara, do you want to take the next question here as well?
Yeah, sure. It kind of sounds like the next question, we sort of touched on it a little bit. I have noticed some character glyphs change completely when I play around with various axes. Why does that happen? Does anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, just like the previous example that I've shown, for some axes, there's different sets of outlines for different values. And another example of this is italic. So even though italic is one of the registered axes, most of the time, italic and the linear version of it is actually just two binary drawing, like two sets of drawings, one for the linear version and one for the italic version. Whereas something like slant actually is a continuous axis where if you slide around on the slider, you'll see the text like slant tilt one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like it's sort of up to the type designer, and then they can sort of pass those properties in however they want.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I think those are all the questions. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining.
This has been great. Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's all the time that we have. Thank you for all of your questions that we had and for being so engaged as an audience. We absolutely love it. I can tell all of you love typography, which makes me so excited too as well. Huge thank yous to Amanda and Key for joining us today, and for my co-host Clara, Sula for all of and Vanessa for all of the help behind the scenes, and Damien, actually our creative director, for a ton of our fonts research. So that was super helpful. And also for everybody who helped work on this feature, and all of you for who helped with your suggestions and continue to make this better. If you want to learn more, there's a couple of great things. We have an entire variable fonts website that you can visit, as well as the Help Center article. We'll go into a lot more detail on some of the more subtle nuances that we have as well. And then looking ahead, to next Thursday, we've actually got our next, this Thursday, we've actually got our next office hours specifically on component props. And if you're like me, there's so much we can do with component props. You can learn a lot of really good techniques and also some good ways to use things and things to avoid. So I definitely recommend checking that one out. We'd love to have you join.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that one. If you dialed in later, have no fear. We'll include any links that were shared during the talk, as well as the recording, in a follow-up email later this week. Also, if you enjoyed today's live stream, you can always check out future ones at figma.com/events, like the one we're having on Thursday. And if you also want to catch previous live streams, you can find them all on our YouTube channel. Now, we're super lucky to be able to connect with our community in this way through events like these. And we also love hearing what topics you all are super interested in. So if you have ideas or suggestions, feel free to email us at community@figma.com. That's all from us. Thank you to Key, Amanda, and Anthony, and thank you all for spending time with us. We'll see you next time. Bye.